What if everything you've been told about Jesus is wrong? For centuries, the image of Jesus has been altered, not just by artists, but by those in power who shaped history. The real story of who Jesus was has been hidden, replaced with an image that fits a narrative. But what if we told you the truth is far different from what you've seen? Stick around as we uncover how the church rewrote history to erase the true identity of Jesus. The story of Jesus is more than just a tale from ancient times. It's a symbol of faith, compassion, and transformation that transcends borders and cultures. From the moment Christianity began spreading beyond the small community of Jesus' followers, it became a force that would shape not only religious thought, but also the course of history itself. As Christianity spread across the globe, so did the influence of the church, a powerful institution that sought to define not just theology, but the very way humanity understood itself. In the early days of Christianity, believers were scattered across the Roman Empire. They came from different walks of life, different skin colors, and different cultural backgrounds. Yet, the teachings of Jesus' love, forgiveness, and salvation united them in a shared belief that transcended all earthly differences. The earliest depictions of Jesus reflected this unity, showing him as a man who shared the same struggles and hopes as the people who followed him. In these first artworks, Jesus was not some distant idealized figure, but a reflection of the diverse, often oppressed, people who gathered in his name. As the church grew more powerful, however, something began to change. The simple teachings of Jesus, which had once focused on humanity's unity and the breaking down of walls between races and classes, were slowly being overshadowed by an agenda that sought to control not just the spiritual lives of people, but their very perception of the world around them. The image of Jesus, once a symbol of inclusivity and equality, was starting to be reshaped. As the church rose to power in the 4th century and beyond, it found itself in a complex position. It was no longer just a faith, but a political and social institution. To maintain control over an ever-expanding empire, the church needed to unite people under a common identity. And that identity, for reasons both political and cultural, needed to be one that could resonate with the ruling classes of Europe. In this context, the image of Jesus began to evolve. What was once a reflection of diversity, a symbol of hope for the marginalized, was transformed into something unrecognizable. Artists in the Renaissance, commissioned by the church itself, began to depict Jesus in a way that reflected European ideals: blonde hair, pale skin, and blue eyes. This wasn't just artistic license, it was a calculated move to align the image of Jesus with the people in power, reinforcing the idea that the divine was somehow tied to their dominance. This transformation wasn't just about art, it was about control. The church wasn't merely defining how Jesus looked, it was defining how the world would see him, and, by extension, how they would see themselves. As the centuries passed, these images of a white European Jesus became so ingrained in the collective consciousness that they began to replace the truth. Jesus was a man from the Middle East, born into a world of poverty and oppression, with skin that reflected the land he came from. What the church achieved through these altered images was subtle but powerful. They shifted the narrative, erasing the historical reality of Jesus' identity. By doing so, they not only reshaped how we saw Jesus, but how we saw ourselves and each other. The implications of this shift are still being felt today, as history is rewritten in ways that serve the powerful, and truths are buried under layers of carefully constructed myth. As we explore the power of the church to reshape history, it's important to look at one of its most significant manipulations: the image of Jesus Christ. If we trace back to the early days of Christianity, we'll find that the first depictions of Jesus were far different from the pale, blue-eyed figure that has become so familiar today. In fact, the Jesus of the earliest Christian art wasn't a European man at all. He was a reflection of the people who lived and followed him, a figure who bore the features of the region in which he was born, a Middle Eastern man, with darker skin, just like the people of his time. In the early Christian world, Jesus was often portrayed as a simple man. He was shown with a gentle, compassionate face, often with dark hair and a strong, warm presence that spoke to his humanity. He wasn't placed on a pedestal of unreachable divinity, but rather he was depicted as one of the people, someone who had suffered, who understood pain, who knew what it meant to be oppressed. The earliest Christians, living in the Middle East and North Africa, knew exactly what it meant to feel the sting of poverty, injustice, and the harsh hand of an empire that ruled with iron fists. So, their art reflected Jesus as one of their own, someone who looked like them, a man of color, born in the land of the oppressed. The evidence is undeniable. In the catacombs of Rome, where early Christians were forced to worship in secret, we find some of the oldest surviving images of Jesus. These depictions show him as a young, beardless man, often wearing a simple tunic, his skin dark and his features unmistakably Semitic. In fact, one of the earliest and most famous images comes from the Catacomb of Priscilla, where Jesus is shown as the Good Shepherd. He's portrayed not as a distant regal figure, but as a humble caretaker, guiding his flock through troubled times. This Jesus was not a European king, but a Middle Eastern man with dark skin, just like the people around him. As Christianity spread beyond the Middle East and North Africa, it began to take root in Europe, and as the church's power grew, so did its ability to shape how Jesus was perceived. Slowly, the image of Jesus began to change. The Jesus of the oppressed, the poor, the marginalized. His image became diluted and transformed into something more palatable for a new European audience. A change that was as political as it was theological. This shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, subtle, but profoundly impactful. By the time the Renaissance arrived, artists were no longer simply interpreting religious stories through their cultural lenses. They were creating an image of Jesus that fit a very specific agenda. The Church, now an institution of immense political power, wanted to present a vision of Christianity that aligned with the European aristocracy. In this new vision, Jesus wasn't a poor brown man from the deserts of the Middle East. He became instead a regal figure, a man who looked more like the European nobility than the men and women he had originally come to save. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael painted their depictions of Jesus not as a Middle Eastern man, but as a figure who resembled the European rulers and elites of their time. With blonde hair, fair skin, and piercing blue eyes, these depictions of Jesus were now tailored to reflect the power structure of the Church's new home, the courts of Italy, Spain, and France. They weren't just making art, they were rewriting history, carefully crafting a narrative that would be passed down through generations. But this wasn't just about art, it was about control. By changing the image of Jesus, the Church was also altering the perception of divine power itself. Jesus, as the Son of God, could no longer be a humble man from an oppressed region. Instead, he became a symbol of divine authority, power, and most importantly, whiteness. This transformation didn't just affect religious imagery, it reshaped the way the world understood power and race. By erasing the darker-skinned Middle Eastern Jesus, the Church was reinforcing the racial hierarchies that dominated Europe at the time. This shift in Jesus' image wasn't just a matter of artistic choice. It was a calculated decision to align Christianity with the growing political power of European empires. By depicting Jesus as a European, they were subtly suggesting that divine favor rested with those who were in power, those who were white. It wasn't just about creating an image of Jesus. It was about creating an image of power, one that would continue to dominate the cultural and religious landscape for centuries. But the question remains, what was lost in this transformation? The erasure of a brown-skinned Middle Eastern Jesus doesn't just alter history. It alters our understanding of who Jesus was and what he stood for. When the Church decided to replace his true image with one that reflected European ideals, they erased a crucial piece of the story: Jesus' identity as a man of color, a man from an oppressed people, was buried beneath the layers of European domination, leaving us with a skewed vision of history, one that serves the powerful but erases the truths of the oppressed. As we continue our journey into the transformation of Jesus' image, we can't overlook the incredible influence the church had in this radical shift. It was no longer just about the representation of a humble man born in a Middle Eastern town. It was about the creation of a new narrative, one that was more in line with the political and cultural forces that began to dominate Europe. The image of Jesus was no longer just a reflection of the oppressed. It had evolved into a symbol of divine power that could no longer be tied to the brown-skinned, humble figure from the dusty streets of Bethlehem. The seeds of this change were sown in the early days of Christianity, but it was in the heart of the Renaissance that this transformation reached its full force. The Church, once an institution of faith and humble origins, was now a political powerhouse, an empire in its own right. And with power came influence. The Church no longer saw itself merely as the guardian of spiritual truth, but as the center of a vast European network that controlled not just religion, but art, politics, and culture. In this new era, the depiction of Jesus was no longer simply a religious act. It was a tool to solidify the power of the Church and the European aristocracy. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael were commissioned by the Church to create grand, awe-inspiring works that portrayed not just biblical stories, but the very nature of divine power. As the Renaissance brought about a revival of classical Greek and Roman ideals, it was inevitable that these artists would draw upon European concepts of beauty and human perfection. And so, they began to paint Jesus not as the dark-skinned Middle Eastern man who had once walked among the poor and oppressed, but as a pale, blonde-haired figure, often with piercing blue eyes. The image of Jesus began to mirror the European elite, the same elite that had the political and religious control to dictate how the world should see their Savior. It's important to remember that this wasn't just an artistic choice, it was a statement. The artists of the Renaissance were not simply capturing a religious figure, they were crafting a vision of Christianity that aligned with the ideals of power, authority, and dominance. By depicting Jesus as a white European figure, the Church was sending a message that divinity, salvation, and grace were not for the marginalized or oppressed, but for those in power. The images of a European Jesus were not just about religion. They were about reinforcing the existing power structures. Why did this shift happen? It wasn't just about art or theology. It was about politics. The Church, now intertwined with the European monarchies, saw the need to unify the people under a single vision of Christianity. By aligning Jesus with the image of the white European elite, the Church could reinforce the idea that the divine had chosen them to lead. They could show the masses that the rulers of Europe were not just human beings, they were divinely ordained. The white European image of Jesus was a reflection of that divine favor. But the shift was also cultural. Europe, with its growing power and wealth, had become the center of the Christian world. The teachings of the Church had spread beyond the borders of the Middle East, and in doing so, the Church began to reshape not just the spiritual life of its followers, but their entire worldview. In this new Christian order, Europe was the epicenter, and the image of Jesus had to reflect that. To do otherwise would have been to undermine the very authority the Church had worked so hard to build. In this new world order, the marginalized, those from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, were left in the shadows. Their image of Jesus was no longer the one that mattered. The Church was now in the business of shaping the future, and for that, it needed a Jesus who looked like the rulers of the day. Religiously, this change also had profound implications. By shifting Jesus' image from a humble, oppressed figure to a regal white one, the Church reinforced the notion that divine favor was not for the poor or disenfranchised. It was for the powerful. Jesus, who had once walked among the sick, the poor, and the oppressed, was now seen as a figure who had the potential to elevate those with wealth and status. This change in imagery wasn't just an artistic endeavor. It was a religious one. The very nature of salvation and grace was being redefined, and in doing so, the church solidified its grip on power. In essence, the church had made a conscious choice to craft a new image of Jesus, one that reflected the power structures of Europe and the church itself. By turning Jesus into a white European figure, they reinforced the idea that the divine was connected to those in power, leaving behind the original message of Jesus, who had come to bridge the divide between the oppressed and the powerful. The message was clear. The divine was no longer a force for justice, equality, and inclusion. It had become something that upheld the status quo, something that protected the powerful and kept the marginalized in their place. But as we now look back, we see that this erasure of Jesus' true image wasn't just an innocent shift in artistic style. It was part of a larger strategy to control the narrative of history itself. The church didn't just change the image of Jesus, they changed the very way we understood power, race, and religion. The consequences of this grand manipulation, this erasure of Jesus' true identity, ripple through history and are felt even today. When the church made the conscious decision to replace the dark-skinned Middle Eastern Jesus with a white European figure, it wasn't just about altering a painting, it was about altering reality itself. This wasn't simply an artistic shift. It was a reshaping of perception, a recalibration of how the world would understand power, race, and religion. Imagine for a moment what it means to grow up in a world where your spiritual leader, your savior, is portrayed as someone who looks nothing like you. For centuries, millions of black, brown, and indigenous people around the world were taught to worship a white Jesus, someone who was so far removed from their own image and experience. The erasure of Jesus' true identity planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the oppressed, whispering to them that divinity, salvation, and righteousness were meant for someone other than themselves. The very figure who had come to bring hope to the poor, the marginalized, the downtrodden, was now portrayed as belonging to a different world, a world of privilege, of power, and of exclusion. This subtle distortion, embedded in centuries of religious art, literature, and cultural narratives, shaped the way people saw themselves and each other. For African and African American communities, the consequences were especially profound. The image of a white Jesus reinforced a sense of inferiority, perpetuating the false idea that those with darker skin were somehow less divine, less worthy of God's love. It became easier for those in power to justify systemic racism, oppression, and slavery when the divine was portrayed as being like them rather than like us. It made it possible for the very foundation of the Christian faith to be manipulated and used as a tool for subjugation. But the impact didn't stop there. This rewriting of history didn't just shape religious perceptions. It permeated every aspect of society. Art, media, and institutions played a central role in perpetuating this false narrative, embedding it so deeply into the fabric of Western culture that it became nearly impossible to escape. Images of a white Jesus flooded the halls of churches, classrooms, and homes. Hollywood, too, played its part, with actors like Charlton Heston in The Ten Commandments and, more recently, Jim Caviezel in The Passion of the Christ, reinforcing the whitewashed image of Jesus for generations. The perpetuation of these images through art and media has had long-lasting consequences on how people of color view themselves, their worth, and their place in society. These images were not just pictures. They were a reflection of power, a declaration of who mattered and who didn't. For centuries, the world was told that divinity had a face of privilege, of light skin, of European features. This narrative was repeated again and again until it became the truth in the minds of many. However, the erasure of the true image of Jesus has not gone unnoticed. In recent years, there has been a growing movement within both the African and African American communities to reclaim the true identity of Jesus, to remind the world that the Savior of mankind was a man of color, born in the heart of the Middle East. Artists, scholars, and activists have taken it upon themselves to challenge the narrative, to push back against centuries of whitewashing, and to restore the true face of Jesus to the world. Through art, literature, and media, They are reclaiming the image of Jesus, not just as a religious icon, but as a symbol of resistance and empowerment. This isn't just a fight for historical accuracy, it's a fight for representation, for a chance to see a version of Jesus that reflects the people who have been oppressed for centuries. It's a call for justice, for truth, and for a world where every person can see themselves in the divine, in the sacred. It's a reminder that the story of Jesus, his life, his message, was never meant to be a weapon of division, but a bridge to unite us all, regardless of race, color, or background. The erasure of Jesus' true image left deep scars on the collective consciousness of humanity, scars that are still being felt today. But as we look back and confront the truth, we also find the strength to heal. The truth, after all, has a way of resurfacing. And now, as we reclaim the true face of Jesus, we also reclaim our own sense of worth, dignity, and humanity. But history has a way of revealing the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried. And as we look to the present day, we find a growing wave of resistance, a movement to reclaim what was lost, to restore the true image of Jesus and challenge the centuries-old whitewashed narrative. It's a fight for justice, for truth, and for representation, a battle not just over a historical figure, but over the very essence of identity and power. Scholars, activists, and artists from all corners of the world are rising up, determined to bring the true face of Jesus back into the light. These voices are challenging the decades of erasure, pulling back the curtain on the distorted image of a pale European Jesus that has dominated Western thought for centuries. Leading the charge are African, African American, and Middle Eastern scholars who are fiercely advocating for a more accurate portrayal of Jesus, one that reflects his true heritage. His true roots. Artists, too, are playing a crucial role in this movement. Through vibrant paintings, sculptures, and digital art, they are reclaiming the image of Jesus as a man of color, reminding us of the revolutionary nature of his life and the significance of his identity. These artists are painting Jesus as he was, a brown-skinned man born in a land torn by conflict, a man whose message was one of love, justice, and equality, values that still resonate with us today, especially for those who continue to fight against oppression and injustice. But it's not just art that's pushing this narrative forward, it's media too. In today's world, the images we consume, the stories we tell, are powerful. And through platforms like film, television, and social media, there's a new wave of representation. Filmmakers and content creators are no longer shying away from showing Jesus as a Middle Eastern man, with the dark features that align with his heritage. This shift in representation isn't just about making history right. It's about giving people the chance to see themselves in the divine. This reclaiming of Jesus' true image is more than just a historical correction. It's a battle for representation in a world that still struggles with inequality. The image of a dark-skinned Jesus doesn't just challenge the whitewashed version of history, it challenges the very systems that continue to oppress people of color. By restoring his true image, we're not just reconnecting with a historical figure. We're reconnecting with the values of justice, equality, and love that he championed. In this powerful moment, the truth comes to light. And as we reclaim history, we reclaim ourselves. As we step back and look at the full picture, we're left with a profound question. What if everything we've been taught about the past isn't the whole truth? What if the history we've accepted so blindly has been twisted, shaped, and distorted to serve those in power? The image of Jesus, once a reflection of the oppressed and marginalized, was rewritten, manipulated, and erased to fit a narrative that served a privileged few. But the truth can never stay hidden forever. Every layer of falsified history has its cracks, and the light of truth always finds a way through. It's time to reclaim what was stolen, to see the Savior for who he truly was, a figure of love, justice, and empowerment for all. What are we missing by ignoring the past, by accepting these lies as fact? Are we denying ourselves the opportunity to connect with a more authentic, inclusive history? This isn't just about reclaiming the image of Jesus. It's about reclaiming the stories, the truths, and the lives that have been silenced for so long. If this video has made you think, if it's challenged the way you see history, don't stop here. Keep questioning. Keep searching for the truth that lies beneath the surface. Dive deeper into the history you've been taught, and allow yourself to uncover the stories that were lost to time. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it with others who need to hear this. Together, we can bring history back into focus. Stay curious, stay empowered, and remember, truth will always find its way to the light.